The Climate Action Reserve is the most experienced and trusted offset registry to serve the carbon markets. As more organizations look to combat climate change and support environmental projects with true integrity, they turn to the reserve to foster real solutions and reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Through Carbon Connection, the Reserve's in house experts will explore our high quality standards for carbon offset projects and discuss climate change practices that benefit economies, ecosystems, and society. Thank you for joining.
Hi, my name is Lauren Wilson, and welcome to our next episode of Carbon Connection, hosted by Climate Action Reserve. Today, we are speaking with our in house expert, Marissa Spence, on our avoided wildfire emissions forecast methodology through our Climate Forward program. Marissa serves as the Reserve's forestry manager and has been deeply involved with the development of this methodology and supporting program implementation. Marissa, thanks for joining.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks, Lauren.
Now, to kick things off, I was wondering if you can share a little bit more about what avoided wildfire emissions describe and how does it address climate change?
Sure. So, what we are talking about with this methodology is the implementation of fuel treatment activities in forests that are at risk for high severity wildfire due to things like fire suppression and past harvesting history. So, things like forest thinning, prescribed burning, and mechanical reduction of surface fuels are all eligible activities. When activities such as these are implemented, what happens is they reduce the fuel load that exists in the forest, creating treatment areas that can essentially act as speed bumps when fire passes through a forest, slowing it down and lowering the intensity. The treatment areas don't prevent wildfire. That is not the goal of the program, but they do change fire behavior and lessen the fire's impact.
Okay, I see. This is a really interesting topic, and I think immediately helpful to have that visual of a speed bump and how this
Right.
acts to really slow down the fires. So, with this episode, it's a special case as we're discussing a brand new methodology that is in development and expected to be finalized and published sometime early fall. So, folks tuning in, be on the lookout for this. But Marissa, I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about why this methodology is being developed and the process it's currently undergoing.
Sure. I'll start with why the methodology is being developed. This methodology is really a response to the threat of high intensity wildfires, which have increased dramatically in the past decade, as we're all aware, in terms of their frequency and severity. Now, we need wildfire. Wildfire is critical to a healthy ecosystem functioning and to biodiversity, but catastrophic wildfires have tragic impacts to things like community health and safety, infrastructure, and biodiversity. High intensity wildfires, of course, also emit many tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, creating pulses of greenhouse gas emissions. The good news, though, is that we do have forest management tools at our disposal that can help improve fire resilience, things like thinning. But the problem is that implementing fuel reduction treatments is costly and typically must be funded through things like grants, which are just not sufficiently available for the scope of work that needs to be done. So, the goal of this program is to leverage the carbon market to generate revenue to implement these treatments that can help mitigate the impacts of future wildfires. So, in terms of methodology development and what that looks like, the process here actually started when Spatial Informatics Group, known as SIG, a think tank focused on forestry research and implementation, they essentially brought a methodology to us at the reserve that they had been working on for the past decade. So SIG had already put a lot of work into this. It was well thought through, it had a quantification approach, but they needed a registry essentially to adopt it, to put it through a stakeholder process, to make certain adjustments so that it would fit within our framework for things like eligibility, the third party confirmation process, and to add social and environmental safeguards. So in this case, SIG was the catalyst for the methodology, and they have certainly done the lion's share of the technical work in helping to bring the methodology to its current stage of development. So I should mention that this is a somewhat different process from what we normally do at the reserve in terms of starting with a framework developed by an external partner. But given the technical challenges involved in this methodology specifically, it was important to us at the reserve to have the framework at least somewhat in place before starting the formal process. But in addition to leveraging the expertise of SIG, we also drew on a process that is customary to the reserve by convening a work group of wildfire experts from different spheres of interest. So, this is something that we've done traditionally with our methodology development. So, this work group included folks like forest practitioners, academics with fire behavior expertise, state agency representatives. And this group met multiple times to discuss important program elements, things like eligibility, quantification, and additionality, and social and environmental safeguards. In addition to this, we also put the methodology out for public comment, which is also customary to our process at the reserve to solicit feedback from an even wider pool of entities and interest groups. And as you mentioned, currently the methodology is in a final stage of revision, and we do expect that it will be formally published and made available for use within the next couple of months. So that's exciting.
That is so exciting. And Marissa, thank you for walking us through the methodology development process and also sharing this scenario of how we leverage external expertise. So, as a group, we can really come together and work towards a common goal of developing methodologies to tackle things like wildfire. With, as you mentioned, if it wasn't for things like the carbon market, we might not have been able to leverage this group and create means for people to actually take on these types of projects. So that's
Exactly.
really exciting.
Yeah,
And Marissa, in a nutshell, what is the avoided wildfire emissions forecast methodology?
sure. Well, as we've already touched on, the methodology recognizes the anticipated climate benefits that can be generated by fuel treatment activities done today that modify fire behavior such that future fires have lower emissions. So that's the basic concept. The quantification behind this is fairly complex, unfortunately, because it involves the use of several different models: a forest growth and yield model, a fire emissions model, and a wildfire behavior model, all coming together for the quantification. That said, we have tried to reduce the overall complexity to the extent possible by prescribing which models and datasets to use and by organizing all the necessary resources that project developers will need on our website in a data repository.
Yeah, I see what you mean when you say things can get a little bit complex, but I also appreciate, and I think project developers coming to us will appreciate that we've taken the models and data sets and organized in a central place through this methodology so that hopefully, everything is clear to folks when they come and look at it. So with this methodology specifically, how will it be impactful to communities?
That's a good question. I mean, the primary purpose of the methodology is reducing emissions from wildfires, but what we also hope with all of our programs that there are community benefits as well, both direct and indirect. So one way that this methodology can hopefully benefit communities is by serving as a tool to improve fire resilience for communities at the wild and urban interface, also known as the WUI. So these are areas where the built environment butts up against the forested landscape, and these communities are naturally at a greater risk of impacts from catastrophic wildfire. So, by having treatment areas provide those speed bumps, as we talked about, to slow fire down as it moves across the landscape, the intensity can be lowered, which naturally reduces the negative impacts to communities if they experience a wildfire in their region. So, in addition to this, it is also possible that this methodology will provide economic benefits to communities, which would be great, by creating forestry jobs. So, projects will need foresters and contractors to plan and implement these fuel reduction treatments. Credit sales can also provide a needed revenue stream to project operators to do things like pay their property taxes and generally to maintain their forest as forest.
Thanks, Marissa. This is really helpful. You've been able to explain to us the communities that are at higher risk for fires and ways that they can really be ready and better prepared for when these fires are going to happen. So using this methodology, I think, is a great tool, as you've mentioned. So
Yeah.
with this, I'm wondering if you can briefly share some of the key eligibility criteria that organizations will have to be out on the look for to submit a project through the Avoided Wildfire Emissions Forecast methodology?
Sure. So right now, projects must be located in the Western US. So states like California, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico are all eligible. And this is really just because these Western states are areas where we have the data repositories that we need to get the data to run those models. And it's hopeful that in the future we'll be able to expand the methodology to other states as well. Projects can occur on private or public land, or even a mix of the two, which will likely often be the case. Projects must occur on land that has been under forest cover for at least 20 years. Projects must be submitted within a year of the project start date when fuel treatment activities are first initiated. And the third party audit of the project, which is the step that results in credit issuance, must be completed no later than 1 year after fuel treatment activities have been completed.
Got it. Yeah, this is really helpful. And it's great to know that we might be able to potentially expand the geographic region of states within the US eventually. But also for anybody that wants to look further detail into eligibility criteria, everything is aligned within the methodology itself. So people can totally look
Absolutely.
in more.
Yeah.
Great. And for AWE projects, what can we expect the typical timeline for these to be?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard to know what a typical timeline might look like for one of these projects at this point, especially since projects can spread the implementation of their fuel treatment activities over several years. And the larger the project, the longer it will likely take to be implemented just based on the logistical challenge of undertaking larger operations and doing those fuel treatments. But the methodology does allow for projects to potentially take as little as 5 to 6 months from when fuel treatments are implemented to when credits are issued. So that's assuming that fuel treatments take place over the course of several months. Project reporting, third party auditing would then be completed within several months potentially of treatments wrapping up, and our own internal review of the project and issuance of credits could take another month. Of course, that's a pretty idealized scenario given how novel the methodology is, and we know there are delays caused for various reasons that projects typically experience along the way, so it could take longer than that.
Right, no, there's a lot of considerations and things at play here, but it's helpful to know that, these timelines can certainly vary, but it does depend on, your size of your project, but it could be flexible depending on who you are. And I think that's also unique to Climate Action Reserve programming general is that we work with you and establish timelines based on your own project. So that's
Exactly.
really helpful. And Marissa, who is going to use this methodology to develop carbon offset projects? And on the flip side, who is going to be purchasing these credits?
Yeah, good questions. So, there are a lot of landowners and fire planning entities that want to conduct fuel treatments, particularly around those buoys, the wild and urban interface. As we've already discussed, landowners often require grant funding or other financial support to be able to implement these treatments at all because fuel treatments are not commercial activities. They don't generate revenue from the sale of forest products. And as such, they will never be conducted at the scale that they ought to be without programs like this to provide that revenue. So while we don't expect revenue from AWE projects to fully cover the cost of fuel treatments, it could very well convince more landowners to do the work they're already wanting to do, but haven't felt they could afford. And we're not only talking about individual landowners, since a lot of fuel treatments are done through coordinated efforts among neighboring landowners that allow sharing of resources to increase cost effectiveness. We're expecting to see projects submitted by local fire safe planning groups, which not only provide for project development efficiencies, but also means that projects are being developed at the landscape scale, which provides for greater overall impact on fire behavior and a lowering of risk, which is great. In terms of buyer interest in AWE credits, in some sense, we don't really know what that demand will be until we have credits issued that brokers can actively market and sell, right? That said, we are expecting that there will be substantial buyer interest in this space as projects are brought online, mainly by virtue of how critical and immediate the problem is in terms of rising wildfire risk. And then, in addition, just generally, we're seeing high interest with buyers for domestic nature based projects, especially when they have things like habitat and species co benefits, both of which are present in AWE projects. So that's a good indicator. In terms of a potential buyer profile, companies are looking for local projects. That's always been the case. So they want to be able to point to their local landscape and see the impact of their investment. So companies with operations in the Western US are likely to be a good fit for these credits.
That's all really inspiring, and I appreciate you laying it out this way because when, we're thinking of generating offset credits on one hand, but then also looking at who's going to be buying these credits, it really is all across the community. People seeing the impact that they're wanting to have in their state or region and really invest back in it. And I think this methodology is a really fantastic way to be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Marissa, this has been so wonderful to learn more about AWE. And I think for folks listening online too, it's exciting that this is going to be coming out within the next few months. So really just to close our episode, I was wondering if there was one question I might have not asked you during this episode. What would that question have been that you would have wanted me to ask? And how would you have answered?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that we haven't really touched on is just how different this methodology is from traditional carbon programs, things like improved forest management, which are based on forest growth and conservation. So, growing and maintaining that carbon stock on the landscape. So, in the AWE methodology, we're talking about incentivizing fuel reductions, which can seem counterintuitive because there is an initial loss of carbon to the project activity. However, the upfront carbon loss is offset by the long term reduction in carbon emissions through severe wildfires, and we know that that benefit can be substantial. So, I think that a methodology like this that recognizes the need in some cases to remove biomass to improve the health and resilience of a forest is a major accomplishment for carbon markets. So to me, it's an accomplishment because there can be a conceptual bias that exists where forest carbon credits are equated with locking up carbon on the landscape. And this is certainly an important climate benefit that forests provide. However, the climate benefits of forests extend beyond this. And my hope is that we will see more methodologies in the future based on restoring forests and improving their resilience to disturbances, which in some cases means doing more active management. But carbon programs that recognize the benefits of forest restoration can help resource practitioners with funding to accomplish a wide range of forest management goals and objectives. And therefore, that's why I think they're important. And then maybe the other thing I would mention is that this methodology is only possible because we have the Climate Forward program at the reserve. And the Climate Forward program has an ability to recognize future climate benefits through what we call ex ante crediting. The AWE methodology is inherently forward looking because we are talking about modifying the behavior of future fires. So there is just not a good way to recognize this benefit under a traditional offset program, which is backward looking at climate benefits that have already occurred. It could be possible to say, for instance, after a fire comes through, to give credit for treatments that had helped to lower the intensity of the fire, but it would not be ideal because some treatments would never be rewarded if there isn't a corresponding fire that passes through the treatment area. So, forward crediting is not always about rewarding landowners sooner than they would be under a traditional offset program, although it does that. But in some cases, it is actually the easiest and most logical way to incentivize certain forest management activities that have important climate benefits. So I think that the AWE methodology is a great example of that.
I completely agree, Marissa. That was such a wonderful, summary of why this is such an important and unique methodology and
Yeah,
why it's so critical to bringing more benefits to forests now and anticipating that, we know wildfires are going to happen, but how can we mitigate those impacts now and be forward looking through our own program? So that
exactly.
I really appreciate you walking us through all of that and taking the time today generally. So thank you so much, Marissa.
Yeah, this has been fun.
And we will definitely keep everyone posted about when the AWE methodology is going to be released. But stay tuned for that to learn more and get your projects ready to be signed up. Thanks, Marissa.
Thanks, Lauren.